Let me try to situate the three quite different responses from our commentators within the taxonomy I present in the book for responses to the Platonists' indispensability argument for abstract objects. The indispensability argument consists of two premises. The first states some criterion of ontological commitment. The second tries to show that such a criterion commits us to the existence of abstract objects, like numbers, on the basis of sentences we take to be true. There are both realist and anti-realist responses to the indispensability argument. One form of anti-Platonic realism is conceptualism, which takes putatively abstract objects to be, in fact, concrete objects, namely thoughts in the mind of God. This view represents the mainstream Christian position from the time of the Church Fathers like Origen until the 19th century. Thinkers within this tradition might accept the Platonists' criterion of ontological commitment, but then deny that the sentences we assert commit us to the reality of abstract objects. Thomas Ward would situate himself somewhere within the conceptualist tradition. Among the many anti-realist responses to the indispensability argument are neomanism and what I call ultima facie strategies. The neomanism believes that there are things that do not exist. For example, unicorns, round squares, the fountain of youth, and so on. Among the things that do not exist are abstract objects like numbers. The neomanism thus repudiates the Platonists' Quinian criterion of ontological commitment, so that he is unfazed by asserting sentences like there is a natural number between 1 and 3. Although there is such a number, it does not exist. Rob Koons advocates a neomanism perspective in his response. Ultima facie strategies are a basket of various alternatives to the prima facie interpretation of sentences, apparently committing us to abstract objects. Ultima facie strategists thus need not dispute and may even accept Quine's criterion of ontological commitment, but deny that the assertions we want to make commit us to the reality of abstract objects. Ultima facie strategists might offer an acceptable paraphrase of the allegedly committing sentence, or they might interpret the allegedly committing sentence figuratively, so that ultima facie, we do not find ourselves ontologically committed to abstracta. Kenneth Boyce offers an engaging version of such an ultima facie strategy. Although I'm not in full agreement with any of our commentators, I am content with all of them, for they all avoid commitment to abstract objects. It's been rightly said that I have never met an anti-Platonism that I didn't like. These diverse views help to show that we are by no means obliged to adopt Peter van Inwagen's Platonic realism. So let's begin with Ward's realist alternative to Platonism. Ward's exemplarism is a type of conceptualism in that it rejects abstract objects in favor of ideas in the mind of God and promises these ideas can do all the work abstract objects can do. It differs from what Ward calls the standard conceptualist view in that God's ideas about anything besides himself are, in some mysterious sense, ideas that are ultimately derived from his perfect self-knowledge rather than non-derivative. More than 2/3 of Ward's comments are devoted to methodological issues rather than to an explication and defense of his exemplarism. So let me begin there. I heartily endorse a method in doing metaphysics that, as he says, demands that authoritative theological claims be taken seriously enough in our philosophical theory building and selection that we end up professing theories that are not only logically compatible with the theological claims, but where relevant are a good fit with those claims. It is therefore ironic that no such method, at least on my part, plays a role in this book. You see, Routledge originally proposed that our book be entitled, "Did God Create Numbers?" But they no more intended this question to be theological than Einstein's question, did God have a choice in creating the universe? In such questions, the word God is used metaphorically. Fearing that people would think that our book was about philosophy of religion, however, Routledge changed the title to "Do Numbers Exist?" and instructed us to make our answers independent of theological considerations. So in my contributions to the debate, I focus on the Platonist indispensability argument for abstract objects and the anti-Platonic defeaters of that argument. The only argument I offer against Platonism is not theological, but a sort of dispensability argument against abstract objects. That being said, as my work elsewhere shows, I do think that Platonism is theologically unacceptable because it compromises God's status as the sole ultimate reality and therefore should be rejected. But I would vigorously protest Ward's characterization of such a method as biased, resulting in conclusions that are not determined by the best theories achievable by merely rational inquiry. To the contrary, I have absorbed the lesson from Reformed epistemologists like Alvin Plantinga that the truths vouchsafed to us from Scripture and the witness of the Holy Spirit are among the deliverances of reason and therefore belong to rational inquiry. Ward's frequent references to lightweight Platonism are also apt to be confusing. Peter and I understand the distinction between heavyweight and lightweight Platonism differently. I think that lightweight Platonism is very difficult to distinguish from neomaningianism and is therefore compatible with God's being the sole ultimate reality. But we both agree that if lightweight Platonism is incompatible with our Christian commitments, then so is heavyweight Platonism. And thus the focus of our debate is not lightweight Platonism. Consider now Ward's defense of conceptualism. When I commenced my study of God and abstract objects, I anticipated that I would situate myself within the mainstream Christian tradition of adopting divine conceptualism as my preferred alternative. But once I began to realize the weakness of the arguments for Platonism and became aware of the plethora of plausible anti-Platonic alternatives, conceptualism lost much of its appeal because it seemed to concede too much to the realist. It still remains something of a fallback position for me, but I see no reason to be a realist. Ward flatters me by saying that I have offered 3 powerful objections to conceptualism. I actually offered these merely as worries about conceptualism. My intention was not to refute conceptualism, but to motivate my Christian colleagues to look more seriously at anti-realist alternatives to Platonism, most of which remain largely unknown to Christian philosophers. I would be delighted if Ward could dissolve these worries and so provide a plausible anti-Platonist conceptualist alternative. As for the bad or stupid thoughts objection, the difficulty is that conceptualism requires that these vile thoughts be occurrent thoughts in God's mind in order to serve as the reference of abstract object terms. But it seems unacceptable to think that God would keep thinking about these things rather than put them immediately out of mind. As for the suitability of God's thoughts to stand in for properties, it seems to me that Ward endorses the view that something is red because it falls under God's concept of red. But that seems to me to get things exactly backwards. Things are not red because they fall under God's concept of red in the way that things are red because they exemplify redness. Rather, they fall under God's concept red because they are red. As for the suitability of divine thoughts for playing the role of mathematical sets, Ward seems to agree that since sets are God's particular collectings, and God and I have different mental collectings, the quote-unquote set I form is not a real set. But if sets are determined by membership, how could it not be the real set since it has the same members? As I say, these are just worries, and I look forward to Ward's forthcoming work in defense of exemplarism. But I would encourage him to ask himself seriously, why be a realist in the first place? Let's turn now to our two anti-realist alternatives. I don't pretend to understand fully Koons's neomaningianism. I do worry, however, that he is in danger of trivializing his bold claim that there are objects that do not exist when he offers to translate his central principles into what he calls Quine speak. For then his claim that there are objects that do not exist becomes the claim that there are objects that do not exist concretely. But that is Peter van Inwagen's position. In order to offer an alternative to Platonism, Koons needs to claim that there are objects like numbers that do not exist at all, whether abstractly or concretely. Now, Koons would free Meinong's original theory of objects of Meinong's characterization postulate or principle, which assigns to non-entities the properties specified by their descriptions. That principle required that an object like the existent golden mountain is both existent and golden, and therefore exists, which we know to be false. As Koons says, the characterization postulate leads to a morass of contradictions and paradoxes. Therefore, the neo-Meinongian needs to restrict in some way the characterization postulate such that an object need not possess all the properties which might be used in describing it. In the face of these problems, Nicholas Griffin complains that the devices required to save Meinong's theory of objects are complex, awkward, ad hoc, and not always clearly successful. Peter Simons makes the intriguing comparison of Meinong's theory of objects to Cantor's set theory. In both cases, the naive theory was found to embody contradictions, and so restrictions had to be imposed. In set theory, restrictions on the principle of comprehension, and in the theory of objects, restrictions on the characterization postulate. In neither case has consensus been reached how this is best to be done. Koons proposes not to restrict, but to jettison the characterization postulate. But then what remains of Meinongianism? What makes Meinongianism unique and troubling is the claim that objects which do not exist literally have properties. In other words, what is at issue here is the Meinongian rejection of so-called serious actualism, according to which only existing objects have properties. As the appellation non-serious actualism none too subtly indicates, views that non-existents have properties are generally taken to be wildly counterintuitive. So, what is left to neomainongianism once the characterization postulate is denied? Reject the characterization postulate, and neomainongianism seems to collapse into another alternative to Platonism, namely neutralism, according to which quantificational logic is taken to be neutral with respect to ontological commitment. The neomainongian would also undercut the indispensability argument for Platonism by rejecting the customary criterion of ontological commitment in favor of a neutral logic. Therefore, sentences quantifying over abstract objects can be true without committing their user ontologically to such objects. That is why the neomainongian is not talking nonsense when he says there are things that do not exist. In this sentence, the quantificational expression is ontologically lightweight, whereas the existence predicate is heavyweight. I've found the work of contemporary neomainongians on neutral logic to be full of insights from which we may profit. So my question to Rob is, what is left to make neomainongianism distinct once you jettison the characterization postulate? Kenneth Boyce provides an anti-realist alternative to Platonism that accepts Peter's meta-ontological criterion of ontological commitment, but offers a strategy for finding an ultima facie reading of sentences that are prima facie ontologically committing to abstract objects that avoids those commitments. I appreciate Boyd's point that by Van Inwagen's own lights, it is not necessary for the anti-realist to find a paraphrase of an allegedly ontologically committing sentence in order to express thereby a proposition consistent with anti-realism. But that point seems a bit ad hominem, being based on Peter's similar claim about the consistency of his anti-realism about inanimate composite objects with propositions expressed by ordinary language speakers about there being chairs. The Platonist might well reject Peter's skepticism about composite objects and so consistently demand a paraphrase. It is therefore helpful when Boyce goes on to argue that a paraphrase is not necessary, even to show that although there are no abstract objects, the world still cooperates with the main point of the anti-realist statement. Rather than supply a paraphrase of the allegedly ontologically committing sentence, Boyce would substitute a non-committing sentence that expresses a proposition that is sufficient to make the same point. I've elsewhere expressed the concern that English may simply lack the linguistic resources to formulate such sentences. For example, what if there were no such words as multi-legged or segmented? Boyce responds to this worry by saying that even if the anti-realist is not certain that English does contain an adequate stock of predicates for the purpose, still he knows that there must be some true proposition that could be expressed by a non-committing sentence in an expanded version of English, one that does contain an adequate stock of predicates. It seems to me that the Platonist, in order to put through his indispensability argument, would have to show that Boyce's alternative is not possible, which he is in no position to do. Nevertheless, I think that Boyce's alternative still lays too much of a burden on the anti-realist, who, in my view, has no need to come up with such rephrasings at all.
I'm going to first reply to Penny. The core of Penny's argument is this. Since I accept A there, I should also accept B. But let's look at A and B. A is, one may consistently believe both the proposition that I, speaking in the ontology room, expressed by uttering, there are no chairs, and the proposition that a speaker engaged in the ordinary business of life expresses by uttering the words, there are two very valuable chairs in the next room. There is no good argument by which it can be shown on purely logical grounds that one of these propositions entails the denial of the other. Because I accept that, I should also accept one may consistently believe both the proposition that the nominalist, speaking in the ontology room, expresses by uttering there are no features, and the proposition that a speaker engaged in the ordinary business of life expresses by the words, spiders share some of the anatomical features of insects. That is, there is no good argument by which it can be shown on purely logical grounds that one of these propositions entails the denial of the other. I don't see why accepting A means that I should also accept B. I accept A because I think that the proposition I express in the ontology room by saying there are no chairs is modally equivalent to the proposition expressed by the sentence, there are no chair receptacle filters, where a chair receptacle is a region of space that's collectively filled up by things arranged chairwise, and a chair receptacle filler is one object that fits exactly into that region of space. And that's expressed by that sentence inside or outside the ontology room. And I think that the proposition that a speaker engaged in the ordinary business of life expresses by uttering the words, there are two very valuable chairs in the next room, is modally equivalent to the proposition expressed by the sentence, for some x's and some y's, it's not the case that there is a z such that z is one of the x's and one of the y's, and the x's are arranged chairwise, the y's are arranged chairwise, the x's are in the next room, the y's are in the next room, the x's are very valuably arranged, and the y's are very valuably arranged. And that's expressed by that sentence both inside and outside the ontology room. And of course, the propositions expressed by 1 and 2, you notice the numbers on them, are logically consistent and even semantically consistent. For suppose that for any x's, if those x's are arranged chairwise, those x's have a fusion is true. Nevertheless, it's not a logical truth. It's not even an analytic sentence, although the proposition it expresses is, if true, necessarily true. I see no parallel argument for the consistency of there are no features and spiders share some of the anatomical features of insects, for I can see no way to frame a sentence that stands to spiders share some of the anatomical features of insects as 2 stands to 1. Okay, and now I move on to reply to Professor Ward. So, as I said in my opening sentence, I've defended the following position. We have 2 statements here. These are on the handout, labeled 1 and 2. I said that statement 1 is no more objectionable than statement 2. And statement 1 is the creedal sentence, God is the maker of all that is, seen and unseen, expresses in context a true proposition, that is, expresses in the context of my reciting it, or you're reciting it in church or in liturgy. And there are things that God has not made, such as himself, his son, and the cube root of 2. I say that's no more objectionable than the scriptural sentence, than this proposition. The scriptural sentence, for God nothing is impossible, expresses in context, that is, in the biblical text, a true proposition, and there are actions God is unable to perform, such as drawing a round square, changing the past, and breaking a promise. But Professor Ward denies that omnipotence, and so to call it omnicreativity, are thus parallel. He has said, this is a quotation from his paper right here, this is on the handout, I'm unmoved by the analogy. When we explain that omnipotence means the ability to do everything doable and not everything whatsoever, these expressions in fact have the same extension. Square circles are neither among the doable things nor the whatsoever things. They're just not there in any way to be done. In clarifying that omnipotence is the power to do the doable, we don't revise omnipotence, we just say some words that might dispel confusion. But I want you to look at a sentence, two sentences in the middle of that. Square circles are not among the doable things. They're just not there in any way to be done. Does that make any sense? I mean, a circle, square or not, is not the kind of thing to which the words doable or not doable apply. It's actions that are or aren't doable. Creation ex nihilo is doable for God and not for me. Breaking a promise is doable for me, but not for God. Drawing a square circle is not doable for me, and if Descartes will forgive me, not doable for God either. Well, I mean, the undoable action, drawing a square circle, is there to be talked about. It's not a Meinongian impossible object. It has a perfectly consistent set of properties. But if you resist that statement, I'll make my point in terms of the action breaking a promise. That's an action that's all too frequently performed. So it's there by anyone's standards, and yet God is unable to perform it. I concede, of course, that square circles are not there to be drawn, but a picture of President Biden planting an American flag on the asteroid Ceres isn't there to be drawn either, and drawing is certainly of such a picture is a doable action. Now, I may be wrong to say that statement 1 is no more objectionable than statement 2, but if I am wrong, I don't think that Professor Ward has located my mistake. Okay, now I pass on to Professor Koons. Imagine first, I'd like you to imagine an archaeologist whose attempts to discover the site of the lost city of Imramhut have so far been an abject failure. His wife, who was not an archaeologist, asks him whether he is sure that Imramhut ever existed. He replies, "Oh, there's no doubt of that. There are lots of documents and inscriptions that give detailed and more or less consistent descriptions of Imramhut, and linguistic analysis proves that they're independent of one another. That would be vastly improbable if Imramhut never existed." Imagine, secondly, a mathematician who is attempting to solve a recalcitrant differential equation called Rostov's equation. Her husband, who gratefully abandoned the study of mathematics as soon as he had scraped through high school algebra, asks her why she is so sure that the equation has any solutions. She replies, "Oh, I know that solutions to Rostov's equation exist. That's an immediate consequence of the Peano existence theorem, which says that if a differential equation satisfies certain conditions, solutions to that equation exist, and it's easy to show that Rostov's equation satisfies those conditions." I think that exist means the same thing in the archaeologist statement and in the mathematician statement. Rob thinks that the word has different meanings in the two statements. I'll try to explain why I think that exist means the same in the two sentences. Consider the following list of open sentences. This is there on the handout. The number of things identical with X is greater than 0. It is not the case that everything is something other than X. There is such a thing as X. X is identical with X. Something is identical with X. There is a Y, such that Y is identical with X. X exists. I would not go so far as to say that the sentences in this list all mean the same thing, but I would say that they come close to meaning the same thing. They're as close to one another as meaning as are the two sentences in each of the following pairs. X has 2 daughters. There is a Y, there is a Z, such that Y is a daughter of X, Z is a daughter of X, Y is not identical with Z, and for all W, if W is the daughter of X, W is either Y or Z. Secondly, X is a descendant of Y. For any Z's, if Y is one of the Z's, and for all W, for all V, if W is one of the Z's and V is a child of W, then V is one of the Z's, then, in parentheses, then X is one of the Z's. In my view, there's nothing for X exists to mean, but something that's as close in meaning to the number of things identical with X is greater than 0, or it is not the case that everything is something other than X, or any of the other things in the list, as 1 is to 1 prime, or 2 is to 2 prime. If, moreover, I were denied the use of exist, I should find any of the other items on the list a perfectly serviceable replacement for it, as far as meaning goes anyway, and then there might be replacement might face pragmatic difficulties like awkwardness, unwanted complexity, and so on. But I certainly consider the number of things identical with God is not zero. And it is not the case that everything is something other than God as perfectly adequate expressions of theism, quite as good as God exists. Rob, of course, will have none of this. He thinks that the number of things identical with the Cheshire Cat is greater than zero, and that it is not the case that everything is something other than Pegasus. And he thinks there's something for X exists to mean, such that the Cheshire Cat does not exist, despite the fact that the number of things identical with the Cheshire Cat is greater than zero. At least assuming that the words the Cheshire Cat are supposed to denote a cat. I'm willing to say that they denote a fictional cat, but a fictional cat is not a cat. I have no idea what that meaning for X exists could be, however. Of metaphysical necessity, cats occupy regions of space-time, and God, who is aware of every cat in every region of space-time, is not aware of the Cheshire Cat. I expect that Rob would respond to this argument by saying that the Cheshire Cat occupies a non-existent region of space-time, and even God cannot be aware of non-existent regions of space-time and their content. And so it goes, and so it goes. And there you have it, a case of ground floor philosophical disagreement. I see no possibility of its being resolved. I'll close by making a few statements on the following paragraph from Rob's comments. The Quinian Platonist faces a dilemma. Are mathematical objects internal to God or external to him? If external to him, then God is not the creator of every existing thing outside of himself. Abstract things would be external things that exist necessarily and are not dependent in any way on God's will. If the abstract objects are internal to God, then we lose any meaningful sense in which God is simple. In either case, it seems that God would depend on something distinct from himself for his own divine attributes. A God saw all abstract objects would be incapable of any knowledge and of any intentional action. Now, I don't know what internal to God could mean if not a proper part of God. I concede that if you're an Aristotelian and you believe in individual accidents, then you'll say there's more to the doctrine of divine simplicity than the ascription of mere mereological simplicity to the deity. That richer doctrine of divine simplicity makes sense only within the compass of an Aristotelian ontology, and therefore, from the point of view of a Platonist like myself, it makes no sense at all. So for me, it's internal to God has to mean is a proper part of God. Well, I'm an Anglican, and the first of the Anglican Articles of Religion begins, "There is but one living and true God, everlasting, without body, parts, or passions." So I suppose I'm committed to saying that in the only sense I can understand, nothing is internal to God. And therefore, I certainly do not lose any meaningful sense in which God is simple, at least not any sense that was there to be lost. Apparently, I'm supposed to face a difficulty because I believe that the cube root of 2 exists and is not a part of God and was not made by God. I don't see it. I'd be the blackest of heretics if I said that my cat Sam, or the neutron star Hercules X1, or the Archangel Michael existed and was not a part of God and was not made by God. The cube root of 2, not so much. In fact, not at all. Why not, you ask? I could write a book. Oh, wait, I have.
Some of the most fearful words to me in philosophy would be uttered by Peter saying, "I have no idea what you mean by that." That's just, every time I hear him say that, I just sweat a little bit. All right, so questions. So here's what we're going to just stand where you are, ask questions to any of the folks up here, but make sure that you address your question. Tell us who you would like to answer your question. Okay, all right, who's first? You, sir. I'm going to call it, say, the brilliant one there. On the
I'll take it. This is a question for Dr. Craig. So it seems that both God and numbers are such that if they possibly exist, they necessarily exist. And this, of course, is an inference that's exploited in modal ontological arguments for God's existence. And to refute that argument, you got to show that God's existence is impossible by showing that the concept of God is incoherent. So wouldn't you need to show that the existence of numbers is impossible in a similar way in order to escape a parallel ontological argument for the existence of numbers?
Well, to escape the ontological argument, you don't have to refute the first premise, but just deny that it's been proven. You can have an undercutting defeater rather than a rebutting defeater. But in the case of Platonism, my principal objection against it would be theological, that it is contrary to the doctrine of Scripture, which is that God is the sole ultimate reality and therefore the creator of everything outside himself, and that this central tenet of Judaism and Christianity is fatally compromised by Platonism, and that would give you good reason for thinking that the existence of these uncreated objects is metaphysically impossible.
you, sir, the brilliant one there.
For Dr. Koons, I believe Dr. Van Inwagen said something to the effect of, it's your view that there are non-existent objects and that I guess these are in a non-existent space somewhere, and you shook your head vigorously. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to say some words in response.
Okay, good. Yeah, let's talk about the Cheshire Cat, I guess. So on the Reformed Meinongian view, right, the Cheshire Cat is not a cat, right, and doesn't occupy any region of space. Okay, it's an entity which, if it existed, would be able to exist or would be able to vanish while leaving a smile behind, or something like that, right? So all those features that we would get from this story are features that are encased within a modal operator here, right? If it actually existed, then So I don't have to worry about running into any possible fat men in the doorway or anything like that, right? There aren't any, right? There are entities that, if they existed, would be fat men in the doorway. Some of them actually exist. So I'm a possible fat man in the doorway if I gain a little bit of weight and go to the doorway, right? But there are also non-existent things that could be fat men in the doorway as well, in my picture. But they're not actually fat or men or in the doorway, those non-existent things. I mean, it seems to me it should be sort of uncontroversial that there are properties that entail actual existence and properties that don't, right? So in some sense of relevance, actually existing, that's a property that entails actually existing. Not existing, that's a property that doesn't entail existing. So non-existing objects can have properties that don't entail actual existence. Occupying space is not one of those, but being thought of by me, or being a character in a story, those are non-existence entailing properties. So to get to Bill's
Why
point,
on earth would you say that the Cheshire Cat has a grin but isn't in space and time?
it doesn't have a grin. It would have a grin if it existed.
Is it? It's not a cat.
It's not a cat.
No.
No, that's
Okay, my neo-Meinongianism is too much based on Terry Parsons and too
that's a
little
different
on
one.
you.
So that's why I don't want to be lumped in with that view at all. This is a Grand Priest version. Right? It's quite different, I think. And
I withdraw my statement about that,
okay, yeah.
but nothing else.
Wow, this is a red letter day for me, actually.
Rob, it just occurred to me to apply this to what we're concerned about here, that this sounds rather similar to Jeffrey Hellman's modal structuralism, that if there were numbers, then 2 + 2 would equal 4. For example, it's a use of counterfactuals to substitute for existence claims. Are you familiar with Hellman's work?
Some of that, yeah. It's similar. I wouldn't go in exactly that way, because I don't think well, I might put it, but in any case, there's definitely a similarity there. In both cases, I think it requires it requires possible worlds occupied by things that don't actually exist, right? And de re facts about entities in those possible worlds, which we can refer to in this world. So in that sense, it's very similar.
Dr. Craig, at the beginning, Dr. Van Inwagen explained how he understood traditional Christian claims that God's the maker of the heavens and the earth, all that's seen and unseen. Could you say a little bit about what you think about the Bible rules that out?
Yes, in my book, God Overall, I provide a fairly detailed exegesis of a number of passages, like the prologue to the Gospel of John and several Pauline passages that I think indicate that God is the sole ultimate reality, the creator of everything other than himself. And it doesn't matter whether or not the authors of Scripture had the conception of abstract objects. What they did have the conception of is that God was the universal cause of everything apart from himself that existed, and that apart from him there was nothing that was uncreated. That is stated very clearly, I think, in Scripture. And then, provoked by Peter's codicil to the Nicene Creed that this only applies to causally related objects, I did some historical study of the ante-Nicene Church Fathers. And what I was surprised to discover was that leading up to Nicaea, there was a considerable discussion among the Church Fathers concerning the status of being agenitas, unoriginated or uncreated, and they were adamant that there is only one agenitas. And they explicitly rejected the views of Pythagoras and Plato that there were other agenita, like numbers or properties or things of that sort. So even if they didn't have Peter's conception of what a property is, it was clear that these ante-Nicene fathers were not willing to allow that there was anything, any agenitas, apart from God himself. And so that was the dual basis for my theological commitments. It's really interestingly related to the doctrine of the Trinity, isn't it? Because the idea was that the Father is agenitas, but the Son is genitas in the sense of begotten.
So in patristic times and or in biblical times, they held that God is the creator of everything that's non-identical to God?
Yeah, well, they held that everything apart from God has been created by God. Yeah.
That's why you said it.
As do I,
Existing.
in context.
Hi, thanks. Tim Paul. I have on the same point that Dale just brought up, the Nicene Creed. This is meant as a second mode that Peter can, or second way Peter could go to give an account of what's going on with the creed. That's not the same one that he gave, but still gives him the same sort of result that he wants for it. And it's based on later church announcements on what the creed meant. So here's one. Of course, your mileage will vary, but this is from Lateran IV, Catholic Ecumenical Council in 1215. And when they parse it, they say this: that is, God is the principle of all things, creator of all things invisible and visible, spiritual and corporeal, who by his almighty power at the beginning of time created nothing from nothing, both spiritual and corporeal creatures, that is to say, angelic and earthly. Sounds there like they're thinking of seen and unseen as corporeal and spiritual, or angelic and creaturely, not creaturely, material. If that's the case, then given that it seems like this cube root of 2, or whatever the example was in Peter, isn't itself a spiritual thing or a corporeal thing, it seems like, at least as Lateran IV understood it, perhaps abstracta weren't intended to be the things being discussed when they said visible and invisible, or seen and unseen. So actually, the second one went to it.
You might worry about, say, Platonic forms. They're not what I call abstract objects, but they're not spiritual or corporeal substances either. It would certainly be heretical to say there were Platonic forms and God didn't create them. Aristotelian accidents, They're certainly not substances at all, because they're accidents. It would be heretical to say that they existed, but God didn't create them. But they're not what I'm calling abstract objects either.
The last time I tried to help you, Peter.
Well, the thing is, spiritual and corporeal substances were the things the church was worried about, because that's the kind of thing that your really serious heretics would try to assert the existence of. There are uncreated energies. That's a phrase that turns up in some of the Greek fathers, and I've never quite understood what that meant. So if anybody can explain that would be interesting.
Could you repeat the question?
So when it comes to the silly things or stupid things,
Yes.
and God putting those out of his mind,
Yeah.
what does that imply about his omniscience, if anything?
Conceptualism requires that everything that God knows is an occurrent thought in his mind so that it can serve as the referent for these abstract terms. But the doctrine of omniscience does not require that everything that God knows he has occurrent thoughts about. I know the multiplication table up to 12, but I'm not thinking about any of those things. But for conceptualism, you've got to have these thoughts actually being occurrent in God's mind, not simply known to him by his omniscience. And then it is hard to understand why God would keep on thinking about horrible, vile things. I could give illustrations, but I don't want to. Just imagine that he or Jesus would be engaged in vile activity. Surely he would put these things out of mind rather than just keep thinking about them.
He would still know them.
Yes, of course. Yeah, he knows all these true propositions.
So why doesn't the conceptualist have that same way out to?
Because he needs concrete entities to serve as the reference. That's the whole point. We should ask Tom's word about this. He needs these as the reference for abstract object terms, not just propositions that God knows, because then you're back to abstracta again. You need thoughts.
Peter, so can you explain within your view what are the objects of singular propositions? So Timmy believes that Santa Claus is on his roof. And so he doesn't believe something about a proposition or merely a property. So what is the object of his belief, or is the belief not singular?
You mean,
Santa Claus is on the roof.
Oh, I see. You
So
just
not
asked,
the truth or falsehood of it.
what is the referent of the term?
What's the intentional object?
Probably a creature, childhood legend or something like that.
So, but
I doubt it was Nicholas of Smyrna.
Wouldn't you say it's an abstract object, just like a fictional character, like Sherlock
Right,
Holmes?
it is. That's why I not a creature of fiction, but maybe a creature of childhood tales or something like that.
now he wouldn't give you that answer, like Timmy wouldn't.
Well, no. So, can't you be mistaken about what the objects of your thought are? So, Robin Hood thinks he's aiming at a deer, but it's actually a fortuitous pattern of light and shadow that happens to counterfeit the appearance. So he isn't aiming at anything, but he thinks he's aiming at a deer. So Timmy isn't, or maybe it is a fake deer. Robin Hood is aiming at a papier-mâché mock-up of a deer, which he thinks is a real deer.
But why treat this example differently than Timmy's thoughts about his deceased uncle?
Well, I believe his deceased uncle still exists.
But- Okay. But if his deceased uncle didn't exist, would his thought be about a fiction?
Well, you could also have a perfectly good thought that is about nothing. That is, if I'm, I think that just as Robin is aiming at nothing, he's not aiming at a pattern of light and shadow, I think. That would be wrong. He's just not, there's just isn't, he's performing the action of aiming, but it has no object.
Professor Evans? Would you like to, we'll end with your question.
Well, it's maybe a very naive question. I don't claim to be a mathematician or know very much about mathematics. But it always, this is a question for Dr. Craig. It always strikes me that one criterion of reality is that when we encounter something that's real, it can surprise us. When we do science, we look for the facts. Sometimes we do an experiment, it doesn't come out right. But it seems to me that when we do mathematics, we have that same feeling sometimes, that we're not just inventing things or making up things, we're discovering facts. And we have a sense that we're exploring the world. That seems to me to point towards realism. I just wondered what Dr. Craig would say about that sense.
What I would say is that that might be a good criticism to make of fictionalism, which is another anti-realist alternative that we have not discussed today. The fictionalist would say that mathematical statements like 2 + 2 = 4, since they are ontologically committing to abstract objects, are not true. They are false. And you might say, but that's implausible because mathematics is a realm of discovery. We're often surprised. But for a neutralist, for example, or an ultima facie strategist, we would affirm mathematical truth and therefore would agree that as you explore the theorems of your axiomatic set theory, you might often be surprised at the results. And this will be a journey of discovery in which new truths are uncovered. So not all anti-realist positions are incompatible with mathematical truth. And that's all that's needed for your point about being surprised and having a journey of discovery.
All right. Well, this has been a great honor. I think we're going to look back at this and remember this for a long time. Let's thank everyone